As poker continues to get more and more aggressive, you're likely noticing more pre-flop 3-betting. Now, what exactly are they 3-betting with, and how do you go about beating 3-betters? Well, let's talk about that in this video. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit. Welcome back to another video, and today we're going to talk about 3-betting ranges through the lens of a hand I played in episode 2 of my vlog. This is played at 1-2 over at Orange City. Without further ado, let's get right into the hand. Alright, in this hand we are under the gun, look down at Ace-Queen offsuit, open to 6. I just got into this game and it's a 200 max buy, so I'm in for 200. Double check, yep, still ace-queen off. Get called by the player next to act. Action folds around to the button, who makes a raise up to 27 total, and I decide to shove it all in after it folds back to me. So let's pause and talk about it from here. So before we start talking about how good or bad this 4-bet might be, let's just talk about 3-bet ranges overall. So I think one of the best things to do is visualize them. I'm a very visual learner. If you are too, hopefully this helps. But essentially there are a couple different ways to construct a 3-bet range. There is a polarized way and there is a depolarized way. If you've heard of any terms like linear or merged, this is going to fit more in that depolarized basket. So something is polarized when it's going to have different poles. So essentially your really strong stuff is going to be the strong side of the pole, and the weak side of the pole is everything else. Now, when you're talking about something that's polarized, you're typically going to see a construction that looks something similar to this, with the strongest hands up in the top left-hand corner of the matrix, and then other stuff. And sometimes it's comprised with a little bit, and sometimes it's comprised with a lot, but that is going to be polarized. You have these two different buckets, the really strong stuff, and then the not so strong stuff. Whereas if we take something like depolarized, that's going to take the super strongest stuff and then the next strongest stuff as well. So if the strong stuff was, say, jacks plus ace king, well, this is going to include the other stuff next to it, right? The ace queens, the pocket nines, the ace 10 offsuit. So this is going to be depolarized, everything kind of mashed up in that upper left-hand corner of the matrix. You notice there's not going to be things like ace deuce or king deuce offsuit or anything like that. It's just everything in this upper left-hand corner pretty much. So that's the way that we can look at a 3-betting range overall. Now, when it comes to 3-betting ranges, one of the things you definitely want to consider is how wide is that overall range. If someone is 3-betting, say, 3% of the time, well, it's going to be pretty darn strong, just because the top 3% of hands are all going to be pretty much mashed up in that upper left-hand corner. There's just not a lot of room for other air. Whereas if someone is 3-betting something closer to, say, 12%, well, you could build 12% ranges a bunch of different ways, but notice how many more hands are included in here once we expand the range out to something like 10, 11, 12%. And if someone's 3-betting even more, obviously it gets wider and wider, and every single hand you add in is just going to be getting weaker and weaker. Now, that could mean something like ace deuce that we're talking about polarized, or it could just mean something like pocket sevens or ace 9 off when we're talking about something that's a little closer to the depolarized side of the spectrum. Now, another thing I like to do when I'm analyzing hands between sessions is to see what the GTO Solver would do. So we're pulled from the Red Chip Poker Live Solve, and this will be released in an app shortly, but for the time being, just going to pull some screenshots from the solve itself. And you notice that this is what the solver is suggesting the button squeeze with, given the exact parameters. So under the gun opens, under the gun plus 1 calls, folds to the button, button squeezes. So this is what the solver says you should be squeezing in that exact spot. And you notice that this is a polarized range, right? It's stuff in the upper left-hand corner, and then there's a little bit of other stuff, including things like ace 5 suited and ace 4 suited. It's a little bit of stuff like ace 3 suited as well, but you get the idea. Whenever you have this separation between the stuff in the upper left-hand corner and some other stuff, especially with separation between those things, that's going to be a polarized range. And this is a 3% range of hands, so it's not like a massive squeezing frequency by any stretch of the imagination. And if the button is squeezing that, then this is what the solver says we should be 4-bet shoving with. And you notice that our ace-queen offsuit is not to be found right this moment. So what the heck is going on, and why did I decide to shove here, and is it any good? So one of the tools you can use to analyze a spot like this is my all-in EV spreadsheet, and I'll leave a link for this in the description box down below if you're interested and want to do some exploration like this. And this just needs a couple different numbers and you can figure out what the EV of your shove is. Now, to be totally fair, there is some simplification happening here, just simply because I'm not really accounting for getting called by the under the gun plus 1 player. I just don't think they're really ever going to be calling here. If you did, then there's other spreadsheets you can use for this to get a more granular look, but I'm going to make the assumption that that dude is going to fold a lot of the time, and that's actually exactly what ended up happening in this hand. Not shocking. So we can just add in a couple different numbers. These are all based upon the hand itself. So notice right this moment that we have a pot of 42 bucks. We have to call $21 more if we want to call here. Effective stack we're shoving is 169 since our opponent had 175 to start the hand, and that is the effective stack. And what is our equity against their all-in range? So essentially when we shove and they call, how much equity do we expect to have? And then also how wide do we think they're 3-betting, and how wide do we think they're going to continue when we shove? So these are just some of the numbers that we have to add in. We already added in the top 3. We just need these bottom couple. We can get all of these using Flopzilla Pro. So let's get to work and make some assumptions. So what I want to do is run this a bunch of different ways, and this is the kind of exploration that I do between sessions for spots that look pretty representative of situations that can come up a decent amount of the time. And when you're talking about playing live 1-2 with not super deep stacks, these kind of spots can come up pretty regularly, and while you may not always take the shove with, say, ace-queen, there may be other situations, and by doing this kind of work, you can start to see, okay, well, if my opponent is folding a lot against my shove, how good or bad is it? If they're not folding very much, how good or bad is it? This is the kind of work you can do that really helps you understand and identify the patterns, so that way in real time you can make much better decisions. So for giggles, let's start by looking at the GTO exploration. Since we've already explored what that range actually looks like, we can actually just plug some of these numbers in. So we see this is a 3% 3-betting range, so we can plug that in right here. And if we also take this and scroll down, whoopsies, we notice that it's suggesting that our opponent call our shove with 1.3% of hands. We'll go back to that in a moment. So the spreadsheet, what is their stack off range, is going to be 1.3. And when we shove and get called by that 1.3%, what are we looking at? And let's just pretty much function it as kings plus and ace king suited. We notice that our equity is 22%. So go back to the spreadsheet, plug that in right here, 22, and you notice that against those ranges, against those GTO ranges, our overall shove with exactly our ace queen off is going to be negative 15 bucks. Not super great. However, let's just say that our opponent was going to stack off a little bit wider. So instead of them just getting it in with this range, we actually think it's going to be something closer to this. Notice now that they're going to be folding less often, right? Because they're continuing with 1.96. Let's just call it 2%, make life a little bit easier. And we notice that our equity is going to go up a little bit, up to 24%. Plug that in. And you notice that this is negative 41. So not super great, but notice a lot of this is very contingent upon the fact that we think our opponent is 3-betting at the GTO frequency, or squeezing at the GTO frequency here. And a 3% 3-betting range is pretty darn snug. So there's not a lot of folding going on after we shove, and when we get called, our ace queen is in terrible, terrible shape. So against those kind of really, really tight ranges, it's not going to be all that great, as we can see. And this shove would definitely be negative EV if we're making the assumption that these are the kind of ranges and frequencies that our opponent is using in this exact spot. Now, in this exact situation, I did not think that my opponent was using GTO ranges. In fact, I don't assume most live players are anywhere close to the GTO solution, but I still like to use that as a general starting point so I have a good idea on what the solver is at least suggesting in a given spot. I actually think my opponent in this situation was a little bit more of a competent looking reg. I hadn't been at this table very long at all, very, very new to it, and as such, I really just have to go on broad strokes. What does this person look like? And how are they handling themselves? Do they seem comfortable, yes or no? They seem like they were likely going to be a little bit more competent, and there's definitely some thought process behind the squeeze, which makes me think maybe it's a little bit wider than just the 3% range that the solver would suggest. So let's actually run this as if our opponent were 3-betting quite a bit wider than that. So let's go to the Flopzilla again, and let's just assume that our opponent is a little bit more, I don't know, something in this range. So this right here is only 6.5% of hands. So notice there's a lot of air, but it's like, weighted air. There's also the strong stuff up here. So let's just make the assumption that it's something like this for the time being. So 6.5% of hands. Boo, boo, boo. 6.5. How often are they stacking off? Well, with all of this, probably just with queens plus and ace king. Probably sounds about right. So get rid of all of this, get rid of all of this, get rid of all of this, and where are we at? We're at 2% of hands again. And what is our estimated equity against that? Still going to be the same 24%. So as it turns out, given that, this is positive to the tune of $3.50. So not the most lucrative thing in the entire world, but notice that this is more profitable, even though we have the exact same equity, we have the exact same stack off range, but because our opponent is folding so much more often, we are just picking up that pre-flop pot uncontested a good chunk of the time, and that's better and better for us. So as there's a bigger gap between the range of hands that they overall decide to squeeze with and the range of hands they're actually going to give that squeeze action with, the better and better this can get for us, simply because we're picking up that uncontested pot more and more often. And to be totally honest, I actually expect there to be an even wider squeezing range for my opponent here, probably something a little closer to 10%, simply because I think they're going to look at this situation and say, well, under the gun +1's pretty much never going to give action, the under the gun guy's probably going to fold a lot of the time, and as such, they probably just ratchet up that squeezing range. So if that's the case, and all of a sudden, even if we don't change that stack off range again, there's just more and more pre-flop folding, now all of a sudden this gets more and more profitable. And if they call a little bit tighter, maybe they call with just ace-king suited, and maybe they call with half of their queens for whatever reason, and still stack off with full aces and kings, obviously. Notice that drops down to 1.1, and now all of a sudden this is getting better and better, even though we do have a slight equity drop down to 23%, right? It's not going to impact things all that much. This is still quite lucrative. So you really have to pay attention to your opponents. How are they 3-betting? Think about it from a frequency perspective first, then think about it in terms of how are they actually constructing that frequency, and then if they are just going to be folding a tremendous amount of the time, definitely look to consider 4-betting a tremendous amount more. Even if it means you have to risk quite a bit more, these can still be very, very lucrative spots if you're paying attention to them and you're looking for them regularly. Because I promise you, you're going to find spots like this, and if you're not taking them, you're not going to notice it all that much, just because it's going to be a bunch of like, okay, you opened and then you folded, so it's down a few big blinds. But if you're missing them consistently, I promise you it's going to massively impact your win rate, and not for the positive, unfortunately. So I think we've done enough math and nerdiness for this hand. Let's just see what the results end up running out like. Under the gun +1 folds, not super shocking. My opponent sweats me out for about 2 minutes, finally hits that fold button, and shipped the little pot over to us. So not complaining, and again, still thinking this is going to be plus EV based upon all that math that we just ended up doing. So if you see the value in doing this kind of work and exploration, and you want to add these kind of plays to your playbook so that way you can find extra plus EV opportunities, I would 100% suggest picking up my math and preflop workbook. Make sure to pay attention especially to the EV chapters and the all-in preflop chapters. These will help you a tremendous amount in building that intuition we were talking about earlier and starting to understand where you can find these profitable plays in every single session you play. You can pick up your copy of this workbook today at splitsuit.com/preflop, or click a link down in the description box, whichever is easiest for you. Again, link is splitsuit.com/preflop. And of course, as always, if you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. And if you enjoyed this video and learned a little bit, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. I massively, massively appreciate it. I'll see you guys back shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.